Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. Today I'm joined by Scott Hawkins, Sean McCarthy, two close members of the Impact Policy crew, and today we're going to take a deep dive into the Raise the Age campaign and youth justice policy as an issue in New South Wales and Australia. A significant issue at the moment. We recorded this in December 2024. And, off the back of recent sort of state government campaigns and election promises and commitments around getting tough on crime and youth time and all that sort of stuff, we dive deep into how much of that rhetoric goes against what we have known for a long time in terms of how we understand youth justice. We take a deep dive culturally into our community's experience and how we look at how we respond better and more appropriately and more trauma-informed when we're working alongside our young people and our communities. And we also talk to a range of sort of lessons and learnings that we want to share with our communities too, things that you can take away, maybe consider in your own practice, in the way that you're working, and how we think about this issue more broadly in society. So it's a cracker of an episode. We could have talked all day about this sort of stuff. We're super passionate. Everyone on here has got professional experience in this sort of space as well. So really hope you enjoy the episode. Thank you. We're rolling, we're in, we're live, all that sort of stuff. People would know my voice by now, hopefully, and they've seen Sean's face before. But we also joined here by Scott, who's first time on the podcast, close friend and family member of the Impact Policy team, associate consultant here, who's done some great stuff with us since he's been connected. And so, brother, I might just give you a moment to introduce yourself for people listening and watching along. If you've got any sort of key or staunch messages you want to deliver to anyone, Bart, straight down the barrel there.
Down the barrel.
Same with you, Sean. We're there, straight down for there for anyone there too. So, over to you, Brad.
Yeah, so like Sam said, name's Scott Hawkins. I'm a proud Nemba man, originally from Bourke, far northwest New South Wales.
Ooh, God's country.
Grew up in Dubbo, also God's country, but straight out of high school, first job was with the Western Aboriginal Legal Service, and basically been working in the criminal justice system as it relates to blackfellas since then. So worked in the Aboriginal community control sector, obviously with the Western Aboriginal Legal Service. Worked with the New South Wales government now for pretty much over 35 years. And like I said, just working in the administration of the criminal justice system and trying to improve it.
Unreal. And I think it's so timely that we get to have this yarn together, because much of the episode that we'll talk to today is really around that youth justice sort of space, an area that we're all really passionate about. And one, I know that yourself has been doing a lot of thinking and writing, particularly around campaigns that we're passionate about as well. So I thought maybe we'd just kick off by maybe having a bit of a yarn about the Raise the Age campaign. It's been pretty topical in the media with recent changes and backflips and different things around what we talk about with that sort of stuff. But Brava, I might just ask you to give us a bit of an intro into that campaign for people listening.
Sure.
Might not know.
I guess for us here in New South Wales, the minimum age of criminal responsibility is 10 years old. And that's what it is basically almost all around the country, apart from the Northern Territory, who have backflipped and have, I believe, recently repealed the legislation that raised the age to 12, and they're going back to 10 years old again. ACT, I think, is the only jurisdiction in Australia now that actually has raised the age to 12 years old. So there are a lot of commitments from different state governments to raise the age, but recent events, I guess, particularly around law and order campaigns, have seen even those states backpedaling on those commitments. So right now, pretty much the age of criminal responsibility here in New South Wales and nationally is 10 years old, which basically means as a 10-year-old you could be sentenced to a custodial sentence, as ridiculous as that sounds.
Yeah, scary, man.
It's even, similar jurisdictions, very much the same. Look at New Zealand or England or places in the United States, very much the same. But the travesty of it, I think for us in particular, is obviously the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids in the system at that age, and the lifetime of offending that follows that.
Absolutely. So Scott's given us a really clear sort of overview of what the Raise the Age campaign looks like in this country right now, the sort of state of the juvenile justice sort of sector when thinking about youth crime, and sort of alluded to, why that's sort of such a challenge and problem. Sean, brother, do you want to maybe talk to, I guess, why that's so problematic when we think about young people and children and the age of criminal responsibility?
I think it's problematic for two significant reasons. There's probably more that I could go into, but I think the first is that we know statistically what happens to kids when they come in contact with the justice system and when they do wind up in detention. And they are far more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system as adults. That's irrefutable. I think there's something like an 80% chance that if you have a criminal conviction as a child, you will then have a criminal conviction as an adult. So the link between offending is very, very high. I think that the second issue is that from a policy point of view, but just from a human perspective, there's a lack of empathy. Like, as a 10-year-old, would you have an understanding of the crime you're committing? I put myself in my 10-year-old shoes, and I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't have the faintest idea what an indictable offence is. And you look at, say, something like break and enter, right? An aggravated break and enter. Would you automatically assume if you're, trespassing or breaking into a house as a 10-year-old or 12-year-old or whatever it might be, that you would have an understanding of what makes it aggravated and how that can worsen your sentence, and really have an understanding of the impact of your actions? Probably not. Like, you might have a degree, but realistically, you're not going to think about the consequences of your actions and that lasting effect that it will have on your life and also others around you until you're an adult. And I know that myself, my cognitive capacity has developed over time, and the way I see things as a 30-year-old or 33-year-old is so different to how I saw them as a 25-year-old or as an 18-year-old, and much differently to how I saw myself saw things as a 10-year-old. So you learn and you mature, but at 10 we can't expect kids to have that level of foresight. It's really unfair, and we're condemning them to this life of incarceration, and we're sort of ripping away their chance at life. So I think there are two really significant issues that I see, or problems that I see with the criminal age of responsibility in New South Wales in particular.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that point, like the medical evidence is really strong that brain development in between those ages, in particular 10 to 14, you just don't have the impulse control, and you like Sean was saying, like, you don't have the comprehension of what the consequences are to your actions, really.
Totally.
Like, we've seen some jurisdictions that have taken a small step in regard to raising the age from 10 to 12, but it's really not enough. Like, it needs to be from 10 to 14 that, we raise the age to 14, because a 12-year-old is still very similar to a 10-year-old. So it's not enough to just raise it to 12, as some states have done, even though the Northern Territory has backflipped on that. I guess the other issue too is, like, there are currently diversions in place to divert young people out of the criminal justice system, particularly in regard to youth justice conferencing here in New South Wales. But again, it's at the discretion of those involved in the justice system, like police in particular, as to whether those diversions are put in place.
Absolutely.
And, like the most recent data shows that diversions out of the criminal justice system are decreasing from a very small base, but that's getting even smaller. So
absolutely.
Even those kids that are being diverted, it's just not enough. It's not enough right now.
Sean made a good point before we started recording, or maybe we still were recording, sort of about what you talked to there with diversionary programs and some of the challenges with accessing them is having to plead guilty as well to be able to access. Conferencing is probably a good example of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And then we sort of see, I think, like, talking about that the medical evidence, and you both talk on that developmental sort of fact when we talk about young people and brain development and things like that as well. Is like we're also looking at that from a sort of general perspective, that we're not even narrowing in on the impact of neurodiversity, cognitive delays, young people living with fetal alcohol syndrome, FASD, and all those other compounding factors too that are impacting that sort of stuff as well.
And I guess too, the fact of the matter is that raising the age is just like the tip of the iceberg of what needs to happen in that space. So it's not just about raising the age of criminal responsibility. It's about raising the age, but also putting all those systems in place that take young people out of those systems that harm and into systems that care. And there's plenty of precedent out there for that. But definitely about, it just starts a lifetime of criminal, involvement in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all the stats say that the earlier you come into contact with the criminal justice system, the more higher frequency of your interactions will be.
And in a lot of ways, like, you hear these law and order campaigns about how we need to lock young people up to make the community safer.
Yeah, adult crime, adult time.
We know all the evidence is there that locking kids up or getting them involved in the criminal justice does not make the community safer.
Absolutely.
It makes the community more vulnerable and unsafe.
Absolutely.
If we could kind of twist the narrative a little bit and show, like, to make the community safer, we need to divert these young people out of the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And not just that too, and I hate looking at it from these terms, but I think it's cost effective, isn't it? Early intervention is economically more effective. It's a better economic model than locking people up. So from an evidence basis, there's really robust evidence to say that being tougher on crime is insufficient and ineffective in actually reducing offending, but also it's far more expensive. So it just doesn't seem reasonable to
save an absolute fortune on the administration of the criminal justice system.
Absolutely.
So not just like the welfare of the young person or the community, but the resources that could be, redirected.
Absolutely.
You look at the justice reinvestment model. Take the resources out of the criminal justice system and put them in the hands of the community to address their own issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's one of those ones, isn't it? For generations, from a policy standpoint and from a sort of, government standpoint, that whole election campaign around tough on crime. I mean, we've seen it recently in Queensland, but it consistently emerges again and again, despite what you both say, the overwhelming evidence that says the opposite.
Because those campaigns are so effective.
Yeah.
Because they are very, emotive. They play on people's emotions. But they also provide really, really simple answers to what are complex questions. And, quite often that's what people want to hear. If there's crime, then lock people up.
Yeah.
People don't want to hear that if there's crime, then you need to actually address the underlying causes of crime. Like, look at the poor employment outcomes, the health, education, housing outcomes. Like, you need to address all of those, along with mental health.
Yeah.
Lack of mental health services.
Yep.
That's an interesting point too, because then links back to an article that I was reading during the week or last week, and sort of links in with the point that Sam sort of mentioned too, around looking at kids that do have a cognitive impairment of some degree, and looking at sort of underlying issues around mental health and having a disability too. And I think it's so there's a degree of undiagnosed cases that are going through the criminal law system, and these kids are not able to advocate or navigate effectively for themselves. There was a case in Queensland where a young kid pled guilty or didn't actually understand the plea, and a plea of guilty was lodged on his behalf, but he had significant cognitive impairments, couldn't understand what crimes he'd committed, and I feel that that's sort of shaking up in criminal cases in youth justice, and there's no sort of real recognition of that too. There's highly vulnerable children, and we're not really doing anything to assist them. If anything, we're being punitive and vindictive, and unfairly punishing them. In my eyes.
Yeah, and it's hard, isn't it? Like, you know, that point around, you know, we want a quick fix, you know, and so if we stop crime, we lock someone up and we're going to solve it, but we know all the evidence says the opposite, and we know that actually addressing what's going on is an investment.
Absolutely.
And you know, even just zooming out of the justice world, you know, how many current Australians are involved in investing in anything, you know? We're all just trying to get by and get through and get on with things. And so even just the concept of going, oh, well, if we do things differently, we might get a better outcome later on down the track is so much far removed. But
locking kids up is like a quick political fix, but it doesn't provide any fix in the long term.
You touched on some other stuff too around the systems work, in the mental health space and different stuff like that too. And that's one thing I think that we see a lot, because we do a lot of stuff from a trauma-informed lens, you know, and you know that as well. And talking about the youth justice conferencing stuff that you mentioned earlier, like that's one of the, I guess, biggest, I'm going to say red flag, but biggest probably, you know, gaps or opportunities for improvement when we think about conferencing and how that's been designed in New South Wales, because that hasn't been designed from a trauma-informed perspective in terms of recognising that for the gross majority of young people that are coming into contact with the criminal justice system, there's generally, you know, I mean, you think about the sort of out-of-home care to prison pipeline, or you think about the impacts of childhood trauma on offending behaviour, we know that trauma is a critical part of, you know, what a lot of young people are experiencing in the justice system. But a lot of these diversion pathways have been developed, you know, conferencing is 20 years old now. And so when that was developed, people weren't talking about trauma-informed practice 20 years ago, whereas now we can have these conversations and really understand it.
And isn't necessarily providing a therapeutic response to a young person's criminal behaviour. Like, I think raising the age of criminal responsibility is not necessarily going to stop young people from coming into contact with, say, the police, but it's about what the police do when that young when that young person comes into contact with them. And right now they can either divert them through the, you know, youth justice conferencing, or they get put through the criminal justice system. But if you have a framework of therapeutic response when a young person comes into contact with police, then you can engage the entire community and the family in that response. And until we're doing that, then it's just going to, you know, like it just leads to that cycle of. And just touching on that, you know, like that cost-benefit analysis, like right now in New South Wales, as in all jurisdictions, you have the common law doctrine of dolly incapax, where children aged between 10 and 14, like the prosecution have to prove that that young person, you know, had the mental capacity to understand that what they were doing was right or wrong. And quite often when that doctrine is applied, then you'll find that the young person they'll get off. They'll get off because of dolly incapax. But people will say that that's a sign of, you know, that courts are too lenient on young people. Well, what it's a sign of is that the courts can see that the young person didn't have the mental capacity, and that all of these resources have been wasted on dragging this young person all the way through the criminal justice system to that point. And then nothing happens. And it's like, well, if we had something else in place right at the very beginning, where we invested in those therapeutic responses,
Yeah.
then like we were
absolutely.
saying, you'd save an absolute fortune on the administration of the justice system.
Absolutely. And we see that so much, hey? Like so much of our systems are continually operating in isolation of each other. So the justice experience, we know that what it really needs is it needs a therapeutic process, as part of that experience, as opposed to a punitive or process-driven experience for a young person.
And I guess what you see right now is that because the police have a discretion as to whether to divert a young person or not, then, I mean, let's face it, racism plays a big part.
Yeah, massively.
And there are less black kids that are being, diverted from the justice system than not. So,
Yeah. Well, over 50%, isn't it, in New South Wales of our kids make up the juvenile justice population.
oh yeah, it's huge. Like
Close to 100% in Northern Territory, if not 100.
And I think too, looking at some recent Boxar data, there's been a huge spike in the amount of like Aboriginal young people, both females and males, coming into contact with the justice system and being incarcerated as well. So it's getting worse, really.
Yeah. And at different times, like we've been the most jailed population in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Aboriginal women are the fastest growing prison population per capita in the world.
I think there was an over 100% increase in New South Wales from 2022 to 2023 or 2023 to 2024. It was insane to see an increase like that, actually.
Yeah, and so these are human rights abuses that Australia would be quite happy to point the finger at other countries for human rights abuses, but
Absolutely.
look at what the Australian governments are doing right here.
Yeah. It reminds me of the podcast we did with Dylan Voller, survived from Don Dale and, a big part of that Royal Commission stuff. And I remember him saying his first time getting locked up was 10 and he threw a rock through his mum's window and his mum called the police and the police were like, oh, well, if you charge him, you'll get your window paid for and get fixed.
Yeah.
And then next minute he was in a truck to Darwin,
Like
300,000 kilometres away.
How many Royal Commissions have we had? Going back to the Royal Commission in Aboriginal deaths in custody.
Yeah.
And what's come out of it? Nothing. I mean, basically none of the recommendations get implemented.
Absolutely. Nothing significant, hey, that's making a dent in what we're experiencing. I mean, that Dondale stuff recommended Dondale be shut down. It's still pumping. So it's like, that's our taxpayers' money that are paying for all these Royal Commissions to all this sort of research or recommendations.
All those taxpayers' dollars that go into filling those juvenile detentions up with black kids.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. So, I know that our audience is very sort of targeted in the sense that, we have a lot of professionals, policymakers, allies and leaders that are working and passionate about social policy in this space listening. But for the general public, if you come across this episode and you're one of those people that sort of thinks like, oh, my taxpayer money's getting wasted and, you fall into that stereotype of, our communities taking taxpayers' dollars, which is often a gross misconception and myth. What you really need to be angry about is the gross misrepresentation of public money in terms of all this sort of stuff that we're talking about.
Because some components of what they call funding for Aboriginal initiatives is jailing Aboriginal people.
Yeah.
So they include money that goes to prisons as money for Aboriginal people. And it's...
Because that's it, right? Like, can you tell me roughly how much it costs to keep one young person in custody in the justice system in a year?
I don't have the figure on the top of my head.
But it's got to be close.
A couple of 100,000.
It is. It is at least.
I'm sure it's higher than that.
It is at least hundreds of thousands of dollars.
You keep talking. I'm going to ask my cousin Siri.
Yeah,
on the phone here.
It is at least hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you think like what could be done with that type of money?
How much does it cost to keep somebody incarcerated in New South Wales?
So 400,000, I think, or 500, $500,000.
It's big.
In 2021, the average cost per day for a young person detained in youth justice was $2,748. So times that by 365. What do you get there? Fucking quick maths.
Almost a mil.
What is $2,700 times by 365? Anyone listening to this right now will know that I went to Glebe High School and we did life skills maths in high school. So
Yeah, I did maths in society, bro.
It's fucking too much. That's what you need to understand. I'll post it in the show notes.
It's too much, and it could be invested so much better elsewhere for the benefit of the entire community, not just for the young person, for the entire community.
Totally.
So wouldn't you want people to have a positive impact in the world? And you're sort of depriving them of that, aren't you? By sending them to jail. I mean, it's not necessarily the benefit, like you said, it's not benefiting the rest of the community, it's not benefiting the rest of society. If anything, it's doing the complete opposite. It's taking away from the rest of society.
That's what I mean. Like, this isn't just a benefit for for the kid or for their family. Like, this is a benefit for the entire society.
Absolutely.
To have productive, healthy people contributing to society instead of being marginalised and being excluded from society.
Yeah, totally. I think you were going to say something?
I was going to say, you mentioned something, like you made a really good point around that pipeline from out-of-home care into like the criminal justice system. Do you think it'd be worth sort of delving into that a little bit too? Because I reckon, for me, my personal view is that in New South Wales at least, but probably Australia-wide, you're not going to be able to reduce the rates of incarceration for blackfellas unless you also reduce the rate of rate of removal, really. Rate that we're coming into care with the out-of-home care system. And I think that holistic sort of approach in terms of early intervention as well, but also support for the family, investment in family systems is going to be beneficial. Yeah, well,
I think, I remember we talked with Vanessa Turnbull-Roberts, she's the Commissioner for First Nations Children and Families in Canberra. She's a survivor of the out-of-home care system as well, and she was saying that when she gets a list every day of the number of our kids that are in custody in Canberra, and she says, when she looks at that list, over half of those kids easily at any one day is a kid that's in care as a ward of the state. And, I think for the most part, it just amplifies the impact of trauma on kids when they're removed from their families and isolated. And we know that our kids are grossly overrepresented in out-of-home care. And we know that, factors around experiences of trauma and disconnection from community, from culture, from identity, then flows on to, disengagement from mainstream school, and then that sort of starts to bubble into the justice sort of space too. But yeah, I think it's there's a clear correlation between getting removed from your family and being put on this sort of fucking pathway to the justice system. I think you got more chance of going to juvenile detention than you do going to university if you've been removed from your family, which is wild to think of. But I think one of the things that talk about Vanessa, she's a survivor of the system, and there's other people that have survived those systems that are doing great stuff as well. But one thing that makes me think about when you ask that question is, we talk about this, and we talk about this as professionals and practitioners in this space. And, all this policy and media rhetoric around tough on crime and all that sort of stuff. But when we've actually worked with young people, and I know we've all had interactions with young people at different stages that are in the justice system, I find that every interaction I am engaging with a young person who is so, almost all the time, so insightful in terms of their experience and their community's experience and the gaps and the needs that they identify, their communities need, and the support that they would sort of be looking for. In my experience from a lot of the stuff I've heard from young people as they talk about access to education and their disengagement from education being problematic, but not problematic because they're not passionate about learning. it's problematic because gaps start to emerge around them being able to stay engaged in a mainstream setting. So maybe it is issues around neurodiversity. Maybe it's just learning difficulties. Maybe there are been earlier gaps in their development, so now their ability to participate at a year 7 level isn't as high as everybody else, and that starts to manifest in their behaviour disengaging. But when you sit down and talk to these young fellas, they all want to learn. They all want to get traded up and working and all that sort of stuff as well. And it makes me think about some of the consultations we did recently with the fellas that we talked to. But yeah, I think for both years, what do you think? Like we've all sat with and spoke with kids that have been arrested and had those experiences at some sort of time. What's that experience like from that?
I think for me, like you said, they were really invested in learning, or really invested in contributing back to society. I didn't get the sense that any kid really wanted to be disengaged from school or disengaged from education. And I think I said this to you as well. A lot of them displayed a level of insight that you would not really find amongst most adults. They were able to really and articulately sort of point to gaps in services, gaps in accessibility to programs and community-based programs. They were able to sort of explain exactly why they became disengaged from school and what would be of assistance in terms of re-engaging with education. I think for me, a big part of this is actually giving them a proper voice and kind of centering them, because I feel like we often with all youth, we often have this tendency to sort of treat them as vulnerable, which they are, but also not give them any agency or power, right? So it kind of
disregard that resilience and that insight.
Yeah, exactly right. So we treat them paternally. We treat them in a paternalistic manner, and we do for, never with. And that's not really cohesive to creating a better society. It's certainly not. It's incongruent with actually identifying their needs and aspirations and trying to develop policy around those needs and aspirations. It's sort of just a continuation of this problem where we don't really give them any agency, and there's just this rank power imbalance there. So for me, I think a big issue is actually enshrining, or a big positive would be to enshrine their voices somehow and center some of their voices and experiences, and actually look at them as having valuable insights and being able to come up with valuable ideas. And it's not necessarily just the kids that, it's not just setting up a youth advisory group, which are generally kids that aren't going to be in the juvenile justice system, but it's actually engaging with those kids that sometimes fall through the cracks, that might be disengaged from school, that might have a difficult, for lack of a better term, a difficult upbringing, or challenges within their upbringing or in their lives that they've had to overcome. They have a wealth of knowledge that we're sort of just missing. And I think there's no real attempt to engage them, and that's the disappointing thing, I think.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on what Sean's saying, I think like there's a real lack of belonging for so many black kids at school. Like, I've like experienced it myself. You just don't necessarily feel a part of that community. Like there's a whole different, there's a whole different school community that you're just not a part of.
Totally.
And as and like these kids are quite often and battling so many things outside of school, and they can't bring the whole of themselves to the school, and because it's just not accepted in so many ways. And like this is an intergenerational thing as well. This is what black fellas are facing, not only in schools but also just in the community in general. So that manifests itself in the school as well, and then that's where you get your poor educational outcomes.
Definitely.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because that's one of the biggest, I reckon, or saddest sort of policy shifts that we saw here in New South Wales is like the reduction of investment into flexible learning programs. So like, alternative education, and it used to be called links to learning for a long time. Like 30 years they had those programs for kids that just, for whatever reason were not fitting in that mainstream setting. And that funding isn't around that supports that sort of stuff anymore. So now what we see is young people that if they're not fitting that mainstream mold, they're now a problem.
Yeah.
And then the pathways that exist for them are problematic pathways. They're deficits pathways. They're not like, designed other learning environments that are designed to recognise that, there might be kids that are dealing with complex trauma or, mental health or other sort of things that are manifesting in struggling to be in that environment. Doesn't mean they want to be completely disengaged from learning, but we see little access to pathways and opportunities for these kids, And I think the biggest reinforcement for that for me is whenever I worked in the juvenile justice centres, on any day of the week, I'd see that their justice school full of kids every day, fully engaged from 9 to 3 or whatever the time was that they went, but none of them were enrolled or going to mainstream school outside of prison.
Yeah.
And the difference was because their learning environment was, it was student centered. So there might be a kid that had a 4th grade reading level with a kid who had a year 11 reading level, but their learning pathway and program was designed to meet them where they were at, so they could engage and not feel like they were left out or silly or all that sort of stuff. But so look, we're just talking about education. We could talk about, health. We could talk about a whole range of other different sectors that are impacting how we start to think about this sort of stuff more broadly from a systems perspective and policy perspective. But maybe you got some examples of what's been working well, like what we've seen maybe across the state or across the country where there might be examples of youth justice stuff that has been positive that people might be able to hear and take some stuff away from?
Oh, look, there's been some things happening in the justice reinvestment space in different locations around the state. I mean, you've got Marinuka out at Burke that's been operating for quite a while now, where where it is looking at trying to take resources out of the criminal justice system and put power and authority into the hands of the community to run programs that address educational outcomes, or address, like kids on the street and, providing services. I know recently they might be providing some nighttime activities. That's something in particular, like not just providing services for young people that are just 9 to 5, I guess, basically, but also looking at those times when they might be on the street and providing a safe space for them, because quite often home isn't necessarily a safe space for those young people, and that's why they're on the street. So yeah, I guess being really, really flexible in regard to those services, times those services are provided, and really putting the running of those services into the hands of the community, because so often you do hear that places like Burke or remote locations, there are a lot of services there, but Aboriginal people aren't necessarily accessing them. And a lot of that has to do with just, being marginalised, not being a part of the community and not necessarily having access to those services. So I think really, really putting that, the running of those services back into the community so that you can provide that culturally safe space in particular. And I think there are efforts being made around the state and no doubt across the country, but it's about getting blackfellas to be able to access those services, and so often it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think that access point you make is pivotal. Hey, I think it's one of the frustrating things that I see. I think like there's a tendency, I think, for just sort of generalist youth services to operate outside of 9 to 5 hours.
Yeah.
But I think we really need to see a shift in terms of how a lot of those services that are also responding therapeutically into complex needs operating outside of those hours too. And that doesn't mean they have to be a late night service or a crisis service or something like that, but they need to be accessible for people that still might be at school or be at work and all that sort of stuff. You know, I think I worked for a service in Sydney, and for the most part, you know, we only operated between 9 to 5, and I had a real sort of a real friction with that. And we tried this sort of late night shopping concept, you know, where Thursdays we were open till like 10, and we'd have like a skeleton staff rotate through, but it was about trying to really champion access outside those times. Because I remember that we would have some clients that would be young people. Like there was this guy I remember once who had his kid removed, but so Fax, Docs, DCJ had given him a list of things and hoops he had to jump through, and you know, one of them was working and all this other stuff. But then he also had to see all this therapeutic support, and he's like, how the fuck can I get to any of this support when I have to be at work from like on the job site from this site?
Yeah.
So like he would bust himself, and then we'd have staff then trying to work overtime so they could stay back for him to get to the appointments. And I remember just sitting there thinking like, nah, like there's something, like we're doing something, well, the system's fucking doing something wrong. Yep. But as a service, we can shift how we are doing stuff as well. Because what we're saying, well, people with complex needs don't go to school and don't have jobs. So we only deal with people that are like, you know, unemployed and got all this spare time between 9 to 5 to access services. And it's the same thing with community engagement.
Yeah.
And then we wonder why, you know, we have all these talented and amazing people in our communities that never come to these engagement sessions, because guess what? At work,
Yeah.
you know, feeding their families.
Yeah.
Like,
And that's a good point too, because I think, you know, people as well, like there's definitely like, you know, that need amongst people, but, you know, you could be working or like going to school, but sort of if you have a mental health issue or complex trauma that's not addressed, or a health need that's not addressed, you know, you could fall through the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
That could force you to sort of become disengaged from work or school or education.
Yeah.
And then once you're disengaged, then you're sort of more vulnerable in a sense. So actually targeting services to those people is going to be really beneficial, because it's ensuring that they actually are supported and helped and assisted before things go really bad. And like you said too, you know, it's almost like you have to choose in a sense. Like we're sort of forcing people, okay, you're either engaging with a service or you're working, or you know, you're going to school or engaging with education, or you can't go to that particular service. It's not really fair or equitable. There's that huge accessibility issue. And I'd also say that too, like services need to provide more outreach to actually, or what I would like to see in service delivery is sort of that flexibility in terms of location too. So it's allowing people to actually engage, or you're going to people that might have difficulties with transport or something like that to engage with them face to face and provide that service and provide that accessibility to services too.
Absolutely. I think one of the things too that I feel like we fall into, even us too, you know, and we have this sort of lens that's really strengths based and solutions focused as well, is that we still also, I'm guilty of it, is falling into thinking about solutions, programs, policy, projects that responds to a problem with a young person. And I'm really trying to get conscious at even peeling that away from how I've been conditioned to being like, actually, let's just look at providing any young person from our communities with the same access, equity, inclusion, and justice in their community and their country as every other kid.
Yeah.
And let's start with that. And if they can access sport just like every other kid on their street, if they can access the classroom just like every other kid in their street, you know, health, you know, whatever, let's get that stuff right when we think about that and that experience of community and connection. And then if there's still problems that are bubbling away, then we're like, okay, now maybe we need something that's a bit more sort of justice targeted or behaviour targeted, you know?
So like it's about strengthening the entire community so that you're not just responding
Yeah.
to, say, criminal behaviour.
Totally.
But you've got strong communities, and there's
Yeah.
been plenty of
Yeah.
government slogans and programs that have been called strong communities.
Yeah.
But that's what it's about. Like that's what needs to happen in these regional and remote communities in particular, because you have seen for so many decades now, like the infrastructure ripped out of so many communities, and now like you can see what the consequences of doing that is, and you can clearly see that build a safe community. You need to have those services. You need to have kids in education. Like you need people in jobs, and like so often it's not happening.
So I think that jump into why I'm talking, because you look like I just cut Sean off for everyone listening. I think it's also a big part of that sort of stuff you sort of lean into there is like about community care as well. I feel like there's this big sort of growth in terms, like I think of the Worker First Nations response here in, they're based out of Gadigal and they do a lot of food security work. But that food security work that they do is often, they're not just doing food security. There's a flow on in terms of connection and information and referral and all this sort of stuff that's connected to the work they're doing, that goes into strengthening communities and families. And so it makes me think about some of that sort of stuff when we think about, like, sometimes the solutions aren't, sometimes some of the most strongest solutions in our communities don't have all these flash bells and whistles on them. Sometimes it's just about giving our communities the agency and resources to care for each other and be there for each other and support each other. I think it's not a mob specific one, but I was at this Youth at Risk conference the other month and I had this young South Sudanese fellow who'd been locked up as a kid in Melbourne, and he was speaking on this panel, and he's sitting there and someone asked from the audience, what would have helped you, not get locked up? And he goes, to be honest, it's one of the biggest things that stopped me from committing crime was playing basketball. And my family couldn't afford it anymore and no one could take me to my games. So I had no outlet, and next thing I knew I was doing the wrong things with the wrong people and caught up in this cycle. And I was sitting there thinking, fuck, so if you just had one fella that could have mentored you and taken you to your games and some funding to cover your basketball fees, maybe you would have had that one outlet that could have, been a bit of a pathway for you to stay away from stuff that put you down that path. Nothing innovative and crazy in that. That's just a way for our communities to care and support each other, and support access. But yeah,
you look at the nighttime basketball programs as well, and Woolloomooloo and Redfern and I think Waterloo and stuff like that, or Glebe.
Yeah.
Just a way to sort of bring community together in a positive way too. So it's those little things that sort of give you pride of community, that give you a bit of connection, means the world to people too, and it probably helps build that community health, really, like that whole of community health, and that's invaluable, really.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it sounds so simple, doesn't it? Like
that's it, right?
To feel like you're part of a community and to stay engaged and to have outlets and to have opportunities to basically participate in society and not be on the margins of society, then could make a whole world of difference.
Absolutely. Think about I think one of the challenges we see in our communities, particularly with programs where the government's funded or supported this sort of stuff, is you see good stuff start and then the funding gets ripped.
Yeah.
Because it has not been evaluated as effective based on, maybe government standards or government changes and priorities shift and funding gets stripped again, or programs wrap up.
If you want to get run out of town, go into a community and say you're running a pilot program.
Yeah, exactly. They'll tell us it's a fucking 10th pilot in 5 years. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's what happened with circle sending, didn't it? Because it meant 6 or 7 or 7 or 8 outcomes, but the one outcome it didn't mean
was reducing
recidivism, but the narrow scope of that, and it was just completely scrapped. So you'd argue that it had an overwhelmingly positive impact.
In particular in regard to restoring some confidence in the operation of the justice system, to say the least. But, absolutely.
And I mean, it goes again, even just that that one evaluation metric for success around reducing recidivism, when we talk about everything we've yarned about on this podcast so far with the trauma and all those factors that impact that sort of behaviour, it's not going to get fixed in one circle sentence in intervention, or experience. But it might not get, maybe, we need to also uncover, like, what are we talking about when we talk about recidivism? If someone's got a history of violent offending and then now their recidivism is around, like, getting caught in a stolen car in the back seat, like, I don't know, for me, that's a win.
Absolutely.
So it's like,
absolutely.
Or the rate that they commit crime. Rate that they offend. Like they might be in and out of court like once a month or once every couple of months. If they go through a long stretch where they're not in contact with the justice system, you'd say that could be an improvement too.
Absolutely.
So. Yeah, and again, we're looking at the wrong end of the system too. Like we're looking at someone who's probably been involved in the criminal justice system for all their lives.
Totally.
And then focusing on their recidivism when what we should be looking at is the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely.
The underlying causes.
Yeah.
Or the underlying. It's
Look at where they start in that system.
Yeah. That's what we're really trying to look at with the evaluation of the Wallama list pilot. And that's a lot of the stuff that we heard in the design of the evaluation framework was about really understanding that recidivism data, because a lot of, like, I think it was particularly the legal stakeholders were like, for some of these clients, it's the longest they've ever gone without offending by us being a part of this project, or their offending severity has dramatically increased. I don't think there was one person, evaluation's not finished, I'm probably talking out of school, but for the most part, like, there was no increase in offending behaviour for the most part for a lot of participants. So, there's been recidivism for participants on that project, but when you look at the actual characteristics around that behaviour and time sort of between, it's quite significant. And it comes back to that case by person by person sort of understanding, as opposed to just zooming out and looking at the numbers and then scrapping something or making a decision to invest in something as well. But
that's a good point too. And then you're looking at people involved with the Wallama list too, like that therapeutic aspect of it, where they link people in with like cultural programs or link them in with rehab programs too. It's this addressing of the underlying causes or the social determinants of crime, and I think that's something that I personally like to see in the justice system when there is that therapeutic approach, and I think that's something that's often undervalued, but could make the world of difference in someone's life, but further that to society more broadly.
Yeah, and like the only problem with something like the Wallama list is that it's just not widely enough available. Like you can only really get a really small number of people through it. When quite obviously, like, imagine the benefit that could be could be available to the wider.
Oh, for sure.
Wider justice system.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's something that you bring up a lot as well, that it's not just necessarily something that would be beneficial to blackfellas, but it's these sort of methods and ways of working and approaches are sort of would be beneficial to all communities or not people across New South Wales or
absolutely,
Australia or really the world.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about our people on this episode, particularly around youth justice, and our experience of trauma is heavily rooted in the impacts of colonisation and intergenerational trauma and how that manifests today. The same rules apply for most young people coming through the justice system, is that there's significant issues of trauma, significant issues of social disadvantage, and all the other factors that we talk about as well. We're just talking about it from a nuanced cultural perspective too. But you're absolutely right. Like, the way we think about justice from a systems level broadly, Wallama is a great example of how that sort of approach, that, centering the person before the court and understanding why they're there and looking at factors about addressing those reasons why they keep coming back before. It just makes sense.
Well, it's about it's about wrapping those services around the individual, And like you said, like that, if the person's at the centre of it,
Mm.
and so quite obviously you can see that that would be of benefit to anybody
Yeah.
who's in that situation.
Absolutely.
It's like you're addressing the root cause, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're not just addressing the symptoms as they arise. It's sort of more effective, and it's going to have more of a lasting long-term benefit,
Yeah.
rather than really addressing it as it emerges.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
you're not just addressing the criminal behaviour. You know, like most of the time, that's all that happens in a court.
Yeah.
You're addressing the criminal behaviour, like you're getting sentenced to, you know, whatever. You're getting sentenced to jail, you're getting sentenced to a fine, or, you know, whatever it is.
Yep.
But there's no real addressing of the underlying causes of why you're there.
Yeah, yeah. I remember fellas saying, like, I've never said more than one word. You know, I've been coming into court since I was 12 years old. I've never said more than one word. And now in this Wallama journey, I'm for the first time understanding how all these factors, you know, from my childhood to how I'm experiencing it, are manifested in now how I live my life and why I keep coming back into custody. And you like the level of insight people are starting to get through that participation in that justice journey is profound, you know. And I think like it's not something that, you know, obviously not all offences would be, you know, appropriate for approach like that. But when you think about like the makeup of the prison population, you know, it's not what the mainstream sort of community thinks it's full of, you know, Ivan Milats and, you know, sorts of stuff like that. But if you actually look at the demographics of the prison population, you'll find that for the most part, that's made up of people that are in there for non-violent crimes, that are living with issues around mental health, addiction, trauma, and all that sort of stuff as well. So when you start to actually understand the population of people that are accessing these systems, we start to really understand that what we've built is broken and it's not doing what was it intended for, you know. And I think, you know, issues of Wallama, they're like you said, quite small in their capacity at the moment, but they do provide a bit of a glimmer for how we can start to reimagine this stuff for everyone.
And if you're in that system for long enough and you're continually told that you're a criminal, then that becomes your identity. And, you
Absolutely.
know, like, you know, there's no acceptance of the fact of what's actually brought you into that system. You just see yourself as a criminal because that's what society tells you.
Totally. It's funny, like we're working on some of the evaluation design for that, and we brought in as Aboriginal researchers and practitioners in that sort of space, and it's funny. It's a funny one, hey, when we talk about research from an Indigenous standpoint, because for the most part, you know, research, you know, we try and bring in sort of like decolonized sort of methods to how we think about that sort of stuff. But I guess one of the frictions in that sort of space is research is so heavily rooted on, you know, what's evidence-based and what's reinforced, you know, why we're making the decision to think about things like that. Whereas I think as blackfellas, we approach understanding an issue by being informed by our community and our collective. And so for us, you know, I think like spending time with the fellas in the prison cells and doing that sort of engagement work, a lot of the stuff that we sort of probably tried to champion as maybe a bit of a decolonial method was met with a bit of friction because, you know, it's, that's not sort of generally how that sort of stuff is done, you know. Or I think one of the ones that I was experiencing some friction around was this sort of appetite to pathologise culture and as an outcome of that experience,
and assess culture,
and assess culture, you know, and so that was one of the ones that, you know, we felt some real friction around, and all that sort of stuff too. But
that was a difficult one because they wanted to quantify culture, so they wanted to see whether an investment in quote unquote like cultural programs had a benefit. So almost like putting a cost benefit analysis on accessibility to cultural programs. And we were of the opinion that it's all dependent on the individual that engages. Like the appropriateness of a cultural program for myself is going to look different to Sam and it's going to look different to you. So You know, like if I was going to be engaged in cultural programs, you know, I might want to learn Gumbaynggirr language, but for you, it's probably Yampa or something that's really relevant to your personal experience and journey. And that kind of concept was really hard to convey. That there needed to be a level of subjectivity in this, and an actual sort of like, if we're looking at cultural programs, then we need to look at the suitability of what was proposed, rather than just being, you know, were they given access to a cultural program? Was that cultural program effective? Really closed questions and sort of a really rigid evaluation method. And that, like, too often our mob misses out because those methods are applied, aren't they? Like social sentencing, for instance, you know, there's a whole range of other things that we miss out on, because really we're looking at it through where we're assessing something through a Western lens, a Westernized lens that is not understood by non-Aboriginal people. So yeah, that was and I only caught the back end of those discussions, and I guess I was frustrated, but
I was having kittens, particularly when I was finding out that the lead researchers were going to be non-Aboriginal. Maybe thinking about assessing culture as one of those metrics, but I digress there. But yeah, I don't know. I think when I think about community programs too, you know, I think about like some of the most successful things that I reckon we've seen in our communities is when we find a way. It comes back to that community care stuff. It's often been community led and driven, paid or unpaid, and it's been consistent over a significant period of time. And so I think a lot about Tribal Warriors Clean Slate Without Prejudice boxing program, and you know, Uncle Shane will talk and give the sort of genesis behind that sort of stuff. But, you know, born out of the Redfern riots, community imploding on its head, you know, police and community relations really, really poor, youth crime through the roof. And, you know, things have significantly shifted since then. But my memory of that, why I talk to that, is because of how I remember throughout over 10 years that's been going, they've gone through, you know, periods of time where they've had 300 people at a session. They've gone through periods of time where there's been 10 people at a session. And, you know, I'm sure they've got funding that supports it and all that sort of stuff. But I remember Uncle Shane saying, like, no matter what happens, no matter who is showing up to this, no matter who's funding this is happening Monday, Wednesday, Friday at this time. And the power of that consistency for community, I feel like, is just, there's so much strength in showing up and what that means for our people. Yeah. And you see people that have dipped in, you know, and then they come back at different stages. You know, they've got that connection with Long Bay and boys coming out from the Bay that are coming in there as transition post-release, in terms of strengthening those community connections that we know are critical and also most vulnerable in those periods immediately post-release as well. So I think, I don't know, what do you think about that sort of stuff? Because I just think like that just tells me about how much, you know, it's one thing for us to say that, and then I don't want to be saying that for people listening that are from our communities. I'm not saying that in terms of the sense that like trying to put that responsibility on people to be like, oh well, so what? It's our responsibility to solve all this stuff. I guess what I'm saying that because I feel like it's if we can find the agency to continue to keep pushing forward without government funding us or not, depending on the response, I feel like that's what's going to get us the significant long-term impact, maybe in some cases.
I think that, you know, like with so much of government services, the only success is measured in just pure numbers.
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's not a successful service unless it gets this X number of people through the door. But obviously that doesn't measure the impact that whoever has, you know, got that service. Like, what has the impact been on those individuals? But I think, you know, like, in particular, in regard to, like, you know, the most successful programs or the most successful services that you see in our communities are those that respect the, you know, the fundamental principles of self-determination. You know, like that goes with co-design too. Like, you know, like co-design is essentially, you know, self-determination. And you see those organisations that are built on self-determination, you know, like Aboriginal Legal Services, Aboriginal Medical Services, you know, they might have their ups and downs, and it might be, you know, not always, you know, great, but look how long they've survived and look at the services that they've provided to our communities over decades now. And like, there's no denying that.
Yeah.
You know, at some point, government recognised that self-determination was the way to go, and look at, you know, the impact that those two organisations have had.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
some of that those community-led programs as well, always have this unwavering sense of purpose, right? And it's usually to give back to their local mob, to give back to their local community in some way, shape or form. And I feel like sometimes with government funding, there's that nebulous purpose as to why they're investing in something. And I feel that sometimes can degrade the integrity of approaches. Certainly from my experience working in government funding, being responsible for providing government funding to programs, sometimes that is just missed. That kind of like, why are we doing this? Why are we actually providing funding? Like, what is the benefit of this? And I feel sometimes people do take that really punitive view that it's not the right to have access to those services, that it's a privilege and that it can be taken away at any time. And with community-led programs, it's almost different. They'll find ways to operate. I think they'll always have that community first mentality, or they often have that community first mentality, which really helps build that connection with the local community. But it also means that, you know, they're better able and better equipped to provide services and to deliver as well, because of that connection, because of that imprint they have, because of that positive impact that they've achieved. That they sort of are better placed. I think like you made a point around consistency, and I think that's an issue with government in terms of how they fund. There is that lack of consistency. Budgeting cycles do not meet the needs of our communities, and they're arbitrary too. They're sort of developed by government. They're sort of developed by Treasury. It is not necessarily a hard and fast rule. They often step outside that, but they often don't do that for Aboriginal communities. So, you know, I think there needs to be that shift from a government point of view in terms of how they fund community services and how they fund Aboriginal services as well.
Yeah, and there's that whole point too, like just going from there, like the criteria that can be attached to funding for Aboriginal programs or Aboriginal services can be much stricter than what it is for mainstream services.
Absolutely.
Yeah, particularly for not just much stricter, but for lower amounts too.
Yeah.
For meager paltry amounts of money. And, you know, look, I've been a part of, I'm not blameless. I've been a part of those systems. I have I've probably contributed to the problem at times. So it's not necessarily having a go at people, but often I think if we're going to look at being effective and having the best positive impact, then we've got to really review how we actually approach funding, and the way that we're doing it at the moment is just ineffective.
And even on those occasions where there might have been found to be wanting administration within Aboriginal communities, then look at how you build capacity within those communities to actually to run their organisations better.
Absolutely. And that exactly right. Hey, like there's such a massive gap in terms of how we fund like running costs of services. And then so there's a constant people will constantly throw stick at our communities about having a capability gap or issues around governance or different things like that at a community level, when our communities like often come out, or an organisation or response has grown out of like volunteers at a local level trying to respond, bootstrapping everything that they can to try and have an impact, and then the only stuff that they're getting funded for is the actual delivery. So they're not getting funded for governance development. They're not getting funded for systems and processes and all this other stuff that all these, really wealthy, long-term sort of not-for-profit organisations have had the privilege of for so long. Yet we'll be the first to throw stick at an ACO going like, can't run their show on that. And it's like, we're setting it up to fail. If we want them to succeed, we'll invest in them. You know?
And a lack of investment as well is a barrier to meeting outcomes as well. So sometimes having a lower level of investment will actually prevent you from being effective. Will often prevent you from meeting outcomes, having that positive benefit. Whereas most people see it as like a way to ameliorate or avoid risk. It's actually not. It's actually increasing the risk because you're increasing the risk of the program failing or the deliver service failing because you haven't funded it effectively. You're not sort of giving them the tools to actually do their job. It's like asking someone to do 5 days of work in 2 days. It's impossible in most cases.
Well, and you see those big mainstream charities that compete for the Aboriginal dollar, basically.
100%.
And they've got the resources to actually, understand what government wants in regard to funding applications, reporting. Whereas the Aboriginal community organisation might not necessarily have.
That's it.
That, and so the mainstream charity organisation is far more palatable to the government than what they have.
They got their marketing and comms budgets. Our people are just struggling to get wages paid to show up for programs. That's a big part of what we do here. Like it's a lot of, we recognised early, particularly because we're all mob, we all come from the community. We've all worked at some level alongside community as well. We're not ignorant to the fact that the services that we provide at Impact Policy are just as needed by our community organisations. Research, strategy, design, engagement, communications, they're all just as valuable for our community orgs. And so that's why one of the big things that we champion and that we've done in the past, Sean developed the policy on it, is making sure that our communities have the same access to the services we deliver. So we really champion that. Like we've talked about First Nations response and some others as well, but we want to make sure that at Impact Policy, those same services that we deliver for the public sector are accessible for our people as well, whether that's pro bono or at cost within whatever budget they're working with, And I think that's something that we need to sort of see more across the sector. We need government filling those holes that yous are both brought to, but we also need other businesses stepping up and looking to where they can invest in capacity building at a local level, not through charity, but just through supporting access to the services and knowledge that they have too.
And I think that's a good point and a good delineation because it isn't charitable. It's about accessibility, isn't it? And that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that we're all working together and that our ACOs and our community orgs and our communities have the same access to services. And I think that's important too. And I would say a big thing that we do, or a big part of our role, is that translation piece between government speak and community. And a lot of the time, particularly around funding or funding applications, you'll speak to a community org and, all their objectives that they've developed, they just don't necessarily have that understanding to label it as such and to make that linkage back in with like an assessment criteria. So it's almost like this level of marketability and sort of just trying to kind of pull out, like a lot of communities really are doing that work. They just need to be able to express that.
Yeah, and I think if you look at it as opposed to looking at it as charity or funding, like it's an actual investment, not only in that community but just in society as general. Like, if you're uplifting, vulnerable sections of the community, it's of benefit for the entire society.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. It's like coming back to that access piece and the benefit from the sector and stuff like that too. We had Jaren in here the other week. She's the CEO of Wyanga Aged Care Services in Redfern, and coming off the back of the episode, she was asking, I'd love to be able to do like a podcast like this with our elders, because we don't really get the chance to capture some of their stories and their experiences and all that sort of stuff. And we said, well, fuck, just come in here, we'll do it for you, like just give you the files and just go with it. But it's like, for our community organisations to even have the capacity to access that sort of stuff it's not realistic. They're worried about doing everything else, on top of that sort of stuff too. It's but the impact of the learning that shares with the sector more broadly is massive. You know, the aged care sector, and whether it's our mob or others as well, you know, it's really significant. There's when I was mentioning that South Sudanese young lad who talked about his offending, his incarceration experience. The other question was like, so what were some of the things that helped you when you got out of prison? And he goes, oh well, I found out that there was actually quite a few programs for the African diaspora in Melbourne that were getting caught up in problems, and you could get support. He goes, but I just never knew of any of them. So again, it's like that sort of, there can be all these amazing organisations doing great stuff, but if they don't have the resources to communicate, they don't have a social media manager and a budget, then how are people getting referred through if not through traditional, justice pathways or things like that? It's wild.
Oh, just on that too, even funding models don't allow for community orgs to access these types of services. They're too rigid in that sense. So, but like you said, it's just about you're connecting with people to make sure that they're accessing your services, aren't you? You're sort of telling your story to make sure people are aware of the assistance you can provide them, and if they're not aware, then they don't access them. So it's really important. It's a really important piece of the puzzle. I
think that's one thing we're good at Impact here is trying to recognise where what we're doing can add value back to our communities, and I think it was very early we sort of started to realise that, even just these conversations and these things that we produce here, our communities could get a lot of benefit out of being able to access and do that too. So, hopefully next year, 2025, we'll have a studio space set up and we can start to support our people to tell their stories, and advocate and have agency around their voices and lived experience for whatever space they're working in or volunteering in or showing up in. What about any sort of messages we're having a big gun. I didn't even start putting a timer on, so I'm sure we've gone for a while, but maybe just some final thoughts for practitioners in the sector, allies, other mob on this journey as well that are plugging it out. Maybe sort of any key words of advice or suggestions for where they could go to from here.
Oh, look, what I would really love to see is the next person who came out in the media talking about law and order and the safety of the community, that we've actually convinced them that raising the age of criminal responsibility is a key component of the law and order campaign.
Yeah.
That if you want a safer community, you want to protect or prevent future victims of crime, then we need to address the underlying causes.
Yeah.
And this is a key component of the law and order campaign that we're running.
Absolutely.
I'll go in a slightly different direction.
Oh, here comes the hand grenade.
Probably not a good one because of my own reservations about this policy framework. But, I'd certainly like anyone working within youth justice or the justice system in general, especially in government, where there's been this commitment to, lowering rates of incarceration for Aboriginal people through the closing the gap measures, to actually consider how you best do that. And for me, you do that by ensuring there is that therapeutic response, that you actually address the underlying causes of crime or the social determinants of crime, and address the underlying reasons for why youth might be offending. And I even hate using the word offending because I think that's problematic. And looking at, raising the age of criminal responsibility as a part of that, as a part of meeting those measures, because I don't think we're going to meet them otherwise, really. And I don't think government can really meet their commitment to closing the gap if they're not looking at measures, some radical measures like investing, like justice reinvestment, or like raising the age as well.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I'd say too is that government and mainstream services have to be brave enough to basically step back and, give the authority and power to communities to address their own issues. Like they've got to, like they will acknowledge that, but when it comes down to stepping back out of the way,
power.
It's very, very difficult. But if they did that, I think that that would make the world a difference.
Absolutely. And I think for myself, I think the more I think about this sort of space from a young person lens or a youth justice sort of add-on, I think about it more from a whole of government sort of systems perspective. We've talked a little bit today about the role of the education sector, the impacts of health and well-being. You just talked about social determinants of health there, and I think we need to zoom out a little bit when we talk about youth justice, and that doesn't take away responsibility from DCJ and other state sort of based agencies like that to be having a lead role in that journey. But I think it's really important that we recognise that there's some other really critical pieces of that puzzle from a public sector perspective, and the more that we can sort of think about this holistically from a whole of government sort of perspective, I think the more we can potentially reduce that risk of moving into that pathway of juvenile offending and crime and stuff like that as well. So that's my dream and hope, and I hope that someone listening to this is working in those spaces and can reach out to the three of us to explore how that might look like more in practice. And if maybe it's a nice way for us to wrap, if you can tell people that are listening and watching where they can go to find out more information about the Raise the Age campaign, if they want to get involved, if they want to support it, where would they go to from here?
Yeah. So there's a national campaign, raisetheage.org.au, and there's also the New South Wales state campaign, and various campaigns in each state.
Awesome. So if this has resonated with you, a little bit of a fire, and you want to get behind supporting some of that, check out the link that Scott talked to there, sign the petition, get behind, a lot of the conversation and narrative, and hopefully we can see that next sort of, public narrative like you talked to, Scott, shifting in terms of how we talk about this sort of stuff as well. Anything from you, my bread?
No, thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, no, you've become a regular, you too, look out. Longest podcast going, it was a good yarn. Could keep going. I think, we can wrap there, but it was good. Really good yarn.